On October 30th, 1938, playwright Howard Koch teamed up with then-Broadway superstar Orson Welles to produce an adaptation of H.G. Wells' iconic science fiction novel War of the Worlds for CBS Radio. Except they didn't adapt it, at least not in a traditional sense. Instead of just dramatizing the book's plot, Koch and Wells opted to stage a super realistic live broadcast of the Martian apocalypse, and the rest is history. The broadcast caused a panic. People rioted, cops tried to break into CBS studios, and Wells went on to direct a tiny little movie you've probably never heard of called Citizen Kane. Now, what does any of this have to do with Limetown? Well, much in the same spirit as War of the Worlds, Limetown is a true crime podcast about a fictional crime, and large amounts of attention are paid to making the podcast seem like a real, legitimate piece of journalism. Both of these shows work by eliminating the boundaries between storyteller and listener, forcing the listener to become a character in the world of the story. You see this kind of thing pop up in books and movies too. Epistolary novels like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and found footage films like The Blair Witch Project employ similar gimmicks, but I would argue that audio dramas can be a lot scarier. Think of all the gaps your mind has to fill in when you're listening to a story as opposed to watching it or reading it. All the images you have to come up with to match the sounds that you're hearing. Like War of the Worlds, Limetown aims to capture your imagination by forcing you to use it. And like War of the Worlds, it worked. I mean, people didn't riot, but Jessica Biel sure fell for it.
I thought the podcast was real. Genuinely speaking.
As a matter of fact, Biel loved the podcast so much that in 2018 she signed on to star in and produce an adaptation for Facebook Watch, written by the show's original creators, Zach Akers and Skip Bronke. But Akers and Bronke faced an interesting challenge. How do you show a story that was always meant to be listened to? And how do you make it just as terrifying? In the case of Limetown, they do this by changing who the focus of the story is and what kind of story is being told.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening!
On the surface, Limetown the TV show and Limetown the podcast seem to have the same answer for both questions. The who is Leah Haddock, a reporter for the fictional American Public Radio who's determined to uncover the mystery behind the disappearance of 300 people at a neurological research facility 10 years prior. Among the missing is Leah's uncle, Emil Haddock, who has the ability to read people's minds. More on that later. This also gives us our what. Both shows are, in their purest form, about discovering what happened at Limetown. Episodes in both the TV show and the podcast feature interviews with Limetown survivors, gradually revealing what went down at the facility, which, as we come to learn, involved an attempt to harness Emil's unique powers in the form of a brain implant which would allow people to communicate telepathically.
I can hear the future.
Spoiler, it worked. The chip was a resounding success, so much so that people in the town started going insane over it. To make a long story short, a third-party company comes in, kidnaps all the people who had the chip, kills everyone who doesn't, and then buries the whole thing so they can steal the technology for themselves. How's that for causing a panic? But a story is more than the sum of its parts. The best stories connect with us on multiple levels and for multiple reasons. Limetown the podcast couldn't just be an engaging mystery thriller, it had to make you feel like you were a part of it, and unless you're gonna make a 10-hour found footage film, that's incredibly hard to do in a television show. So first you have to change whose perspective we're seeing this all from, and while Leah in the podcast and Leah in the TV show might seem like the same character, they're actually way different and serve different roles in their respective stories.
My name is Leah Haddock, and I am an investigative reporter with APR.
In the podcast, Leah is a narrator first and a protagonist second. She hosts the Limetown podcast and acts as our liaison through the Limetown story, relaying information through self-recordings, interviews, etc., etc. Podcast Leah doesn't get a whole lot of character, but the character we do get comes from the vocal performance, here by New York stage actress Annie Sage Whitehurst. She's a headstrong, determined young reporter who frequently goes beyond the call of duty to get the facts. She doesn't let on that she had that much of a relationship with Emil, but being his niece gives the Limetown survivors more narrative incentive to speak with her. In a sense, Leah is the ideal vessel for the kind of story this podcast is trying to tell. She's defined enough to organically move through the loops in the show's mystery narrative, but vague enough for the audience to easily slip into her shoes, and that's okay, because at the end of the day, the audience is the lead character. But television is a character's medium, and TV Leah is significantly more defined than her podcast counterpart, and significantly angrier. The biggest change is motivation. While Leah in the podcast didn't seem like she had that much of a relationship with her uncle, TV Leah is shown to have had a formative relationship with Emil when she was a child and was supremely affected by his disappearance.
Is that once you left, Emil, there was no peace? Limetown was the disappearance of you.
As such, she's driven less by a vague altruistic desire to report the facts and more by a personal need for answers. Since Emil was the only person who truly understood Leah, which makes sense if you can read people's minds, she literally cannot rest until she's found him or at the very least knows what happened to him. Since Leah's motivation is different, so is her behavior. For example, TV Leah is a terrible reporter. She argues with her interview subjects.
He wanted me to keep her safe. No one should have to tell you to keep her safe. It's your job.
Blackmails her producer.
If you take me off this story, the first thing I'm telling them is about a manager-subordinate romantic relationship that happened at least 3 times on your desk.
And even edits a soundbite to elicit a reaction from another Limetown survivor.
I only mourned Oscar Totem. If there was a god for this world, Oscar Totem would be what she would send to save it.
Journalistic integrity is for babies. This already changes what kind of story is being told. Whereas the podcast was very much a standard sci-fi mystery with the meta-narrative gloves off, the television show merely uses its mystery as a backdrop to tell a more character-driven story better suited for the small screen. But great character stories require great characters and great stories. For Limetown to be just as effective as a TV show, Leah doesn't just need to be more well-defined, she needs to evolve and change over the course of the show, and that change needs to reflect back on the story in a meaningful way. Leah's character trajectory is pretty apparent from the get-go. Her obsession with Limetown is so intimately tied up with her own unresolved childhood trauma that she lacks the ability to conduct her investigation in a healthy manner. She's manipulative, self-destructive, and as we just saw, in almost Machiavellian control over how listeners perceive both her and the Limetown story. Most importantly, though, Leah seems to have no concept of healthy boundaries. In what might be the most striking addition for the TV show, Leah is shown to have a sound fetish? Let's just say she really, really likes listening to people without their permission. It might be a weird character trait, but this actually reflects the theme of the entire Limetown story. Think about it. Listening is a huge motif in both the television show and the podcast. Emil listens to everyone's thoughts, the chip allows people to listen to each other's thoughts, Leah listens to the stories of Limetown survivors, and we, the audience, listen to her. On the surface, this is a story of hubris. A chip that allows people to communicate telepathically sounds great on paper, but that kind of technology would be catastrophic in a real-world context. To quote the great Jeff Goldblum,
"Scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should."
However, the TV show builds on this theme by baking it into an actual character journey. Since she grew up with Emil, Leah got a first-hand taste of this unique power at a formative point in her development, and then got it ripped away without context. That's why she's so angry. That's why she can't have healthy relationships, and that's why she has this insatiable need to hear things that she's not allowed to hear. She doesn't need to find Emil. She doesn't need to discover the truth about Limetown. Just like the scientists who made the chip, she needs to understand healthy boundaries. Framed in this way, each interview Leah holds brings her closer and closer to this realization. Every Limetown survivor who had the chip implant is shown to have been traumatized by it in some way. Relationships were damaged. People were hurt. Innocence was lost.
The tech expresses what you are thinking, like words express what you're thinking, but not why you're thinking them. The horror of this technology is it gets rid of any pretense. You're exposed all the time.
The human capacity for empathy is at once a blessing and a curse. We're dying to know what's going on inside everybody's heads until we actually get there. People are messy, people are scary, people think things they would never say out loud, and that's why privacy can be just as important to healthy relationships as communication. But the closer Leah comes to realizing this, the more she has to confront her own trauma, and the less healthy her relationships become. Resolving trauma is a hard, ugly process, but that process gets so ugly that in the second to last episode of the TV show, Emil shows up and begs Leah to stop making the podcast.
You're asking me to stop?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I am.
No, I'm not kidding. This whole show is built around finding out what happened to this one guy. And he literally shows up at the 11th hour to offer our lead character the golden ticket to her arc. The ability to have a relationship with her uncle again, as long as she respects his boundaries.
Come with me instead. Come with me, and we'll finish what you started.
No, I can't.
And this is where Limetown gets really interesting. Because when faced with that decision, Leah behaves in the most painfully human way possible.
You have no idea what I've been through. You were alone by choice. I'm alone because everybody left. You left.
Not every character journey has a happy ending. In fact, that Leah doesn't learn speaks to how important it is that we confront our own toxic behaviors and how destructive we can become if we don't.
No, Apple, don't. No. Don't. Please. Please don't. No, please don't go.
How we tell stories can be just as important as the stories themselves. If Limetown is proof of anything, it's that different mediums can serve different stories in different ways. That's what Orson Welles and Howard Koch realized when they were adapting War of the Worlds, and it's what Zach Akers and Skip Bronke realized when they were adapting their own podcast.
Will they kill me?
Eventually. Probably. But hey, you have gotten everything that you've ever wanted. The whole truth.
Both the podcast and the show end with Leah getting kidnapped by the nefarious corporation behind the Limetown tragedy. But how this scene plays in either case speaks to how well these two shows fit their respective mediums.
They're opening the door!
Podcast Leah doesn't go without a fight. She begs listeners to
Don't let them win!
Which feels extremely confrontational in a way that I bet War of the Worlds was to audiences back in 1938. But TV Leah just sits there, saying to herself over and over again,
This is the cost.
like she's now finally coming to the realization she should have come to one episode ago. You see the weight of all of her decisions hit her like a freight train. She's gone too far. She's heard too much. She's got everything she ever wanted and lost everything in the process. It is, quite simply, great television. And it's terrifying.
Thank you for listening.